Hey, everybody, and welcome. This is Kevin Gallaher, and I am the CEO and founder of the Truth Be Told Radio Network. And once in a while, we do some of these extended broadcasts. This is like an extended discussion that I have with one or more of our hosts. And I have Tim Keys on with us, Tim Kynes, however you want to pronounce it. And he does a show called God Save the King. And it's a fantastic show. And he's like a kindred spirit because him and I come from kind of similar backgrounds with biblical accuracy and things of that nature. And he has been over the last 35 or so years fascinated with the subject of the time of Christ's birth and how we have one story that we're taught all our lives, which is basically a mythology. And then this would actually happen that it talks about in the Bible. Although we're not going to be getting into that really too much today, we are going to be getting into some of the stuff that has to do with current events, what's going on right now, certain, trials and things that we see, and looking at this whole thing with the current events around us in perhaps a way that you haven't thought to look at it, and looking at it through a biblical filter. Before we get to Tim, one of the reasons why Truth Be Told Radio Network started is because I myself had a keen interest in the Bible. The things of God, Christianity, faith, current events, politics, history. And I was able to take all of those things and kind of mush them together, and you get Truth Be Told Radio Network, because we're not afraid to talk about any of those things here on the network. So you're going to hear stuff that's going to be straight biblical teaching. Sometimes you're going to hear people even talking about secret societies, their history, and coming to it also with a biblical focus. That's going to make us here at TBTRN much different than a lot of other places where you may go to get biblical or Christian content. I'm not knocking those places. I'm just saying that we're going to stand out a little differently than most of those. And what we try to do here is give you a very well-rounded Christian view of what's going on in the world. Because if we can't, so to speak, stick our finger up in the air, test the wind, if you don't have a good understanding of the Bible and understanding Bible prophecy, you have no idea by looking at what's going on around you where we might be in relation to what the Bible talks about. So that's very important. Tim has got a great website called God Save the King. I believe it's .org. Tim will correct me if I'm wrong when he gets on the show with us here. We're, like I said, in an extended discussion. We're going to be getting into some detail tonight. And so we're not going to be rushed by the 60-minute clock or whatever. When we're done, we're done. I hope that you're going to enjoy this. I know that we're going to try to do more of these with other hosts and hosts in a more, maybe of a round table format. But Tim, I see you grinning down there, yeah. And it's good to see you again. And anything I left out, please add that for people. And then let's jump right into our subject matter for the day.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just to just reconfirm, what you were saying and maybe help the listeners out there. How you pronounce my name, by the way, is it's like your eyes with a K in front of it. Okay. Kais, right? But as you well know, I am a musician. I'm a piano player, in addition to everything else I do. And if you look at my name, Keyes, that's very easily mispronounced Keys. And it frankly may even be the correct pronunciation if you go back about 400 years. So there's really some debate as to whether which is the correct pronunciation, Keys or Kais. And then because I'm a piano player, I've been called Tim Keys my entire life. So I answer to both. It's really just that simple. And then whenever I'm on air, I say it the way I was raised to, which is Tim Kais. And then you're correct. My website is www.godsavetheking.org. And I talk primarily about the nativity, like you said. That is my 35 to 40 year research project that I've been working on, that the traditional nativity story doesn't look, that's really not how it looked. We need to look at the nativity through a biblical and historical lens to discover what it really looked like, not superimpose our modern viewpoint on what we think the nativity looked like. But I also talk about a lot of other biblical subjects because that's who I am and what I do. I'm a Bible teacher. It's pretty much just that simple. I research the Bible, and that's what we're going to talk about today is the biblical perspective of certain modern events. And like you said, hopefully the listeners are going to hear certain things explained maybe in a way they haven't heard before.
Yeah, so please continue. Let's dive into this however you want to do so. And
yeah, absolutely. Let's go. So the first thing I want to share with you and with the listeners is that when I got up this morning, getting about my day as one does, right? And I threw on social media as one does, right? And almost the very first thing that popped up was a little blurb from Tony Dungy. And for the listeners who may or may not know who Tony Dungy is, he is the former head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And before that, he was an assistant coach of the Minnesota Vikings, which is where I heard about him because I'm originally from Minnesota and I'm a Vikings fan. So I know who Tony Dungy is. And Tony is a brother in Christ. And he was commenting on current affairs. And what he wanted to emphasize was to remember that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, that the ultimate battle here is against spiritual powers in high places. And that is true. And I wanted to make sure that we said that, right out of the gate here, is that ultimately this is not about people against people. This is really about the biblical worldview and fighting the much bigger fight. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we don't have to engage people from time to time, because there is a lot of bad information out there, unfortunately. And that's really what I want to address, pardon me, is incorrect information. Because many years ago, I've had this happen more than once, but this was a particularly unique occasion where I was having a great biblical conversation with a really good friend, and out of nowhere, he turns to me and he goes, well, clearly Jesus was a socialist. And I was dumbfounded. When I heard him say that, I literally just kind of choked up and was like, I don't know what to say. Actually, I do know what to say, but I don't know what to say because I'm sorry, dude, that's not true. And I don't know how you reached that conclusion other than being very poorly taught. And he went on to credit that knowledge to his, pastor teacher of his church that he had tremendous respect for. And that was equally as challenging to me because I'm sitting here going, okay, because now you're telling me you've got a Christian leader out there who is apparently teaching that Jesus was a socialist. And
so, in other words, to use a poker analogy, he doubled down.
Yeah, pretty much doubled down. And so my point here is that what I had to do with him and what I've had to do with others over time is to, frankly, to demonstrate to people that socialism is not biblical. Jesus was not a socialist. Absolutely not. It's not even remotely possible. And that's kind of the scary part, is that this isn't a conversation about maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. It's like, no, he was absolutely not a socialist. Socialism is not biblical. It cannot be biblical, period. Okay. So what I want to do with people today, what I want to do is I want to show you and your audience some biblical and cultural anthropological information that will help people understand how and why socialism just cannot be biblical. It's just not possible, right? So what I'd like to do, and then you know this because we talked about this off camera, but we're going to play a little game here. And what we'll do is we'll just pause for just a second. I know you can't pause in audio. You're not supposed to do that. That's bad. That's bad radio, right? But we're going to ask some rhetorical questions here, and we're going to pause for just a second to let the studio audience, the listening audience, think about the answer to the question here. So, because this is rhetorical, right? So as a matter of fact, let's do it this way. I'll actually list the questions for the listening audience, and then that way they can think about them for just a second, and then we'll jump right back in and we'll answer those questions, and I'll explain why this is a rhetorical device, right? So here's the rhetorical device, which is if we were having a conversation in real time where I could pause, right, and let you stew in the question and think about the question a little bit. The first question I would ask you would be, number one, what is your most valuable possession? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Pause, take a second, think about it, etc. Then we'd answer it and we talk about it for just a second. Then I would ask you question number two. Question number two, pretty obvious. It's okay, well, what is your second most valuable possession, right? Pause, take a second, think about it, etc., right? And then finally, what number three, okay, what's your third most valuable possession? What is it in that means the most to you, that cost you the most, or is most, because most valuable is the key phrase there, your most valuable possession. Pause, stop, think about it for a second, and then we would talk about it. And then what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to tell you what I'm going to do, is that the answers to these three questions, when you put them in a certain context, they allow us to see, you're going to see very quickly, frankly, very, very quickly, why socialism falls apart in a biblical sense. So here we go. So let's back up, and now let's answer the questions. What is your most valuable possession? Pause.
It would have to be my life.
Your life. Bingo. It's your life. Okay. And this is why, okay, in our legal system, and in most legal systems around the world, not all, but in most legal systems, we have phraseology like, things with regard to like capital punishment. You're not allowed to take a life without due process of law. Okay. See? So there you go. So your life is valuable. I can't take your life. You can't take mine. I can't kill you. You can't kill me. That's kind of like the highest law there is, right? Okay. So let's play along, right? Next question. So what's your second most valuable possession?
Perhaps my time.
Okay. Well, that's actually should be your freedom.
Your freedom.
Your freedom or your liberty, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So likewise, I mean, you can't just throw someone in jail because, right? So once again, we have this thing called the due process of law. So regardless of what crime you're talking about, whether it's theft or, arson, or, list your crime, you have to demonstrate that a crime was committed and then prove it, quote unquote, in a court of law, and then you can incarcerate somebody, right? So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that we're aware of cultures around the world, societies around the world, where people aren't free to travel. They've got to demonstrate why they need, they have to present, you want to cross the border.
Papers, please.
Yeah, papers, please. Yep, papers, please. Right. So that's just another angle on my freedom. Okay, my liberty, meaning that ultimately, right, seeing a lot of people, here you go, a lot of people want to live by what is really a very simple paradigm, which is, hey, I should be free to do what I want, when I want, how I want, as long as I'm not infringing on somebody else, right? As long as I'm not infringing on someone else's right to do the same. Live how you want, when you want, where you want, make your own decisions. I can't infringe upon you. You can't infringe upon me. And
that's a big reason, not to interrupt, but that's a big reason why when we look at our own Constitution, things are written around the framework of something called liberty, and they don't use necessarily the word freedom.
Right.
Liberty is freedom within certain confines.
Absolutely.
Those confines would be the things that we're talking about right now, like, you're not going to run around killing people, stealing, whatever, because you're now taking from others that which doesn't belong to you.
Yep, absolutely. No, a great insight and distinction there is that, yes, liberty is freedom within certain boundaries, shall we say, right?
Yeah.
So we've asked 2 questions so far. Number 1, what is your most valuable possession? Your life. Number 2, what is your second most valuable possession? Your liberty. Okay, right. And then now your third answer that you already said, which is what's your third most valuable possession, which would be your time. Okay, and most of the listeners are already going to know this. The reason your time is valuable is because it's a commodity that once you spend it, you can't get it back, right? So yeah, and that's why we have phrases like, "Hey, don't waste my time," right?
Yep.
Because it's a commodity.
Ben Franklin, time is money.
Time is money, right? And there you go. Now you're leading into my exact next point. So consider it this way. Think about it. If I spend my time doing something, well, then that's my choice, because like we just said, this is a commodity that you can't get back. So my time is valuable to me, and I can spend, interesting that we use that word, right? I can spend my time doing whatever it is I choose to do. I can choose it to prepare food and enjoy food. I can use it to clean my house or do yard work. I can use it to fellowship or recreate. I can spend time with family. I can spend time with friends. And of course, we can certainly use it to work, right? A lot of us go to jobs on a daily basis where we work and then we get paid. Okay. So these are all things that we quote unquote spend time on, and that we're allowed to do it as we choose. And if you follow the logic here, right? I can't take your life without due process of law. I can't take your liberty without due process of law. I probably shouldn't be able to take your time without due process of law either, because it is a valuable commodity that belongs to you. And then once it's gone, you can't get it back. So yes, so wasting someone's time can be a really, really big deal. Okay. So now what I'm driving at here is, let's think about it this way. Let's say I work a job, and we're just going to pick a random number here. Let's say you're paid $25 an hour and you work 8 hours a day. So you're paid $200 gross for the day. That's $1,000 a week, $50,000 a year, right? So I work my job and then I get paid. Now I can take that money and I can use that money to pay my rent or my mortgage. I can buy food. I can pay my utility bills. And then I can use it on a combination of what the way I phrase it is either necessities or niceties, right?
Yes.
Necessities or luxuries. And then, but it's my choice. It's because it's my money, right? It's my money. Okay. And when you look at it this way, and this is the key point, it's not simply my money, but it represents my time.
Right.
And if it represents my time, then and I did this voluntarily. It's like if I were to work for you, right? You and I negotiate a contract where I agree to do a certain thing for a certain amount of money, right? I agree to paint your house for $10,000. Okay, there it is, right?
Yeah.
The entire house on the outside, big job, right? For a certain amount. So we agree, right? Well, I spend my time, and then you pay me in return. But we both entered into that contract voluntarily. Right?
Well, another interesting point here is that when we had our societies, really before money, everything was barter, trade. So say, you wanted to paint that house, then you would come to me. Maybe I knew I was a baker. Well, you give me so many baked goods and I'll paint the house. So the painting of the house and the baked goods, for example, would have to be, somewhere of equal value.
Correct.
Money is very good in the sense that it acts as a go-between. It translates the effort and time it would take to paint the house on the one hand, and the effort and the time and the value of the baked goods on the other. And now that creates a quote medium or a middle of where the exchange can happen. And it creates a third party, a third type of way in which those two things can be exchanged, and that's how money came about. Now, some products and services are going to be worth more or less than others. So money is what would come in to make that equitable. So, and so going in lines of what you're talking about, we have come to the point where we're using money, and when we get to the point of there being socialism, it's every man according to his need and his wants, and some of those things just don't jive out. And it's one of the reasons where you see the early colonies here in the United States, they got wiped out because of socialism, because what happened was people got paid the same no matter how much work they put into the community. So they'd all be expected, if they're laying on the couch, or back then they weren't watching TV, but they'd be laying on the couch, whatever, and they figured out, I'm going to get the same reward if I'm out there in the field all day, so why do the work? And these are some of the ways in which, because of the equity, socialism constantly fails, because the one thing that I look at when you look at an economic system and politics, and this comes into the politics, Tim, because my definition, this is a Kevinism, I call it. It's politics is nothing more than the personification of human nature, where you can actually see it in action. So things that happen will happen because they fall in line with what human beings would naturally do, their human nature. When things, quote, get political, it's because it's going against somebody's interests, because then there's something else that's happening that's superseding that interest. Now, quote, things get political. So you continue, please.
Yeah, sure. So I absolutely agree with basically everything you have said.
Yeah.
I'm aware of, in American history that some of the early colonists made experiments with socialism that failed miserably for exactly the reason you're describing. But back to the illustration that I was sharing,
go ahead.
I'm hoping this will help people see what is behind their surface level thinking, right? Because just real quick repeat here: most valuable possession, your life; second most valuable, your liberty; third, your time, right? And then the time is the fulcrum to this illustration, because you can't get your time back. So therefore, if I spend my time working, and then I either barter or trade or paid, whichever medium of exchange, right, we use that. See, that represents my investment. So whether I'm holding $500 in my hand, or, like you said, if it's baked goods, or, 3 dozen loaves of bread, whichever it is, it has value to me. Not only can I eat the bread or spend the money, but it represents my time. It represents my life. See, so ultimately, if I work for you, you got a chunk of my life, is really what it boils down to, right?
Yeah.
So now, if we plug in this piece of the equation, and I'm going to deliberately use a slightly more secular way of saying this, because this is you'll hear this in society all the time, you'll hear it in church, and I'm deliberately using a more secular way of saying this than a biblical way of saying it. But you get a lot of people who go, well, there's a spark of the divine in everybody, right? And do you agree that there's a spark of the divine in everybody? Well, sure, I agree there's a spark of the divine in everybody. Okay, well, if we agree on that, if we agree that there is a spark of the divine in everybody, and my life is my most valuable possession because there's a spark of the divine in me, and then my liberty, and then my time, well, guess what? Then that means that whatever it is I choose to spend that money on, whether it's paying my rent or my mortgage or my utility bills or buying food, or whether I use it to take a vacation, doesn't matter. That is my private property. It belongs to me, and it represents my life. So therefore, taking it without my permission, without my consent, No, And if I'm created in the image of God and you're created in the image of God, and someone tries to say, well, I'm entitled to your money, that's like saying you're entitled to my life. It's really not much different. Now, I'm going to give you a chance to interject here in a second, because what I want to do for the listening audience is I want to change gears ever so slightly, take that illustration, set it on the side burner for a sec, and then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to play a little rhetorical game. We're going to ask a couple of questions, and like I said, no dead time in radio. Give people a chance to think about the answer for a second. And then what we'll do is we'll take the two illustrations and we'll put them together. So anything you want to say before we jump into the next illustration?
No, just please continue.
Okay, so here we go. So listening audience, let's play this game, okay? I'm going to ask some rhetorical questions and, you can answer, right? So I want you to think about the 10 commandments, right? But I want you to jump to number 10. What is the 10th commandment? Pause. Okay, you can't really pause. So here we go. Well, the 10th commandment is the one that says, thou shalt not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. Okay, now what we're going to do here is we're going to work in reverse order. So now what's the 9th commandment? Well, the 9th commandment in the formal language says, thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor, or we summarize that as thou shalt not lie. Do not lie, right? Then in reverse order, number 8, what's number 8? Well, number 8 is you don't take anything that belongs to your neighbor. In other words, you don't steal, right? Number 7 is don't commit adultery. And then number 6 is do not kill, do not murder. So what we're focusing on here is, and like I said, if we were to do this in real time, this would be this rhetorical exercise where we would pause between the answers and give the interchange a chance to develop and get you to think about it. And I'd be going, okay, so what's the 10th commandment? Okay, think about it. Okay, come on. What? Okay, don't covet, right? But my point here is what we're doing is we're looking at the second half of the 10 commandments, and we're looking at them in reverse order. Do not covet, do not lie, do not steal, do not commit adultery, do not kill, right? Okay. Now, and then we're going to also get back into that in a second in the slightly more formal language, because it's not simply do not lie. It's do not bear false witness against your neighbor. And I'm one of these people, I know you are too, Kevin, that I'm one of these weird Bible head kind of people that it's like every detail in the scripture means something. There's a reason why things are framed and stated the way they are. But words mean things, right? But let's start with this little bit of trivia that is actually very, very important. Kevin, you know how many laws there are in the Torah? Do you know that one? Trivia question.
There's something, I think, somewhere around 613, I believe.
That's it, right? So there's 613 laws in the Torah. Now, I don't know the exact answer to this. I only know an approximation. Of the 613 laws in the Torah, how many of them address our motivation?
That I don't know.
Okay, it's actually a very small number, right? The vast majority of the laws in the Torah simply address the behavior. They say, do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do that. It's a very small number that actually addresses the internal thinking and the internal motivation behind the behavior. Okay. Most of the time they just say, don't do that. Right. And then the motivation, that's a different discussion for a different time. So, but commandment number 10 is actually one of these times. It is one of the times where the Torah, the commandments, the law of Moses actually addresses motivation. And it says, thou shalt not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now, what does the word covet mean?
To desire something that is not yours.
Bingo. There it is. It means to desire something that is not yours. So what does this commandment mean in plain language? It very simply means you are not allowed to even desire what belongs to someone else. Oh, my word. Think about that one for a second. You're not even allowed to desire it, let alone actually take any kind of action, right? So this goes back to our illustration about private property. If it belongs to you, I'm not allowed to desire it. I'm not even allowed to desire it, let alone take it. Oh my word. See, because what we've got here is we've got a progression. Okay. When you work backwards, you've got a progression of severity that I know this is hard to do strictly verbally. It would be much better if we had some visual illustrations to help people think about this. But what we're diving into here, what I'm doing and trying to help illustrate for people, is that this is biblical and or cultural anthropology. Now, anthropology, it means the study of humanity, the study of the human race and how we do things and stuff like that. So there's biblical anthropology and then there's cultural anthropology. Part of what's going on here is the 10 Commandments describe a kind of cultural anthropology and how societies do things. And there's a lot of hidden information here that people may not be aware of. And as we progress into the subject matter, I'm going to tie it in more detail to where people are going to be able to see this, right? But what you have here, when you take the 10 Commandments in reverse, is you've got an increasing level of not just violence, but an increasing level of severity of infraction. Okay. So it starts with just the desire for my desire for your property, right? That's coveting, or your desire for mine, or just however you want to frame the example. Like we said, coveting means a desire for something that is not yours, right? Okay. So right there, you've got socialism blown out of the water. Okay. Right. Because the Bible confirms and reaffirms private property all the time. There is no.
It even goes so far to have the Jubilee, where then private property is turned back and given back to the rightful owner.
Yeah, I mean, very good point for our listeners that have biblical background. What Kevin is describing is a celebration amongst the Hebrews in the Old Testament, where at a certain time they would restore property to people. In other words, they didn't believe that it was appropriate to confiscate someone's property indefinitely, right? If you were in debt, okay, you might have to relinquish your property for a certain period of time, but eventually it would be returned. And that was the year of Jubilee, was that debts were cleared and and you got your property back and things like that. So that, wow. We could go on a tangent there. I'll do it just for 1 second.
Go ahead.
Think about the punishment that we call life in prison. And we also have a phrase, cruel and unusual punishment. That might be one of the most cruel and unusual punishments there is, right? Because if we compare that to the year of Jubilee, right, and the fact that your property would be restored, right, slaves would be set free, property would be restored. Wow. You think about life in prison. You're never getting out. Your ability to acquire private property is zero, pretty much. You can get a couple of things, if you're in contact with people on the outside, but there's a lot of in-depth discussion we could go into here. But back to my point is that coveting, right? Commandment number 10, right? Desiring what is not yours isn't allowed. Even desiring it, let alone setting in motion a system where somehow I am allowed to take what belongs to somebody else. And let's just cut right to the chase here. Socialism is about establishing a privileged class. It's about establishing, it's the haves and the have-nots, and the haves get more and the have-nots get less.
Well, let me jump in real quick
Go ahead.
here, and I'll turn it back over to you. To
Sure.
point that out, you had to go back to right after World War II, because right after World War II in the United States, you start to see the emergence of what we would call the middle class. And you also got the baby boomer, which I'm in the last year of the quote baby boomer generation when I was born. So what happened is that you didn't have such a big gap between what you were just talking about, the haves and the have-nots. There was a bunch of people in the middle that were well off. They weren't maybe quote super wealthy or rich, but when you look at statistically here in the United States, most people that are wealthy enough to employ people make anywhere from about 400,000 to about $1 million a year themselves. And these are the main people that are able to do things like employ. So they're able to spread that benefit. Whereas in a socialist country, you have the very poor, and then you have this huge gap, and you have the elite of the society. But there's really nothing in the middle. And a sure sign that a country is creeping into being a socialist state is that you see that middle section being completely wiped out. And either they're going, for the most part, into the have-nots, and a few are going into the haves, but that entire middle section is gone.
Absolutely. You and I are in agreement again, and you're simply illustrating the same point in a different way. And
in a different way.
Yeah, because that's it, is that the aim of a socialist culture, which I just said, is to create a privileged class, right? So there you go. You've, like you said, you've got the rich, and then you've got the very rich, and you got the very poor. And as you said very eloquently, the middle class starts to disappear. You're going to go to one or the other. And the reason socialism sounds appealing to people, there's several reasons why it's appealing, but one of the reasons why it sounds appealing is because people think they're going to get something. It's really just that simple. It's I'm not trying to mischaracterize, but at the same time, the reason you have a lot of young people who think socialism works is because they think they're going to get something. They think they're going to get given a living wage or whatever, and it just does not work that way. It's not going to. But that's why it sounds enticing.
It sounds good, and as I've heard it pointed out many times, socialism on paper, oh boy, it looks absolutely amazing. It's like, yeah, that is amazing. But then when it's put into practice, it turns into a shop of horrors.
Right. I both agree and disagree with that in certain ways, because I've had the exact same experience that, when socialism is presented, right, it is made to sound as if it's amazing. So that's why we get I've heard that statement many times. Oh yeah, on paper it's amazing, but in reality it's not. Well, and like I said, I both agree and disagree, because in order for it to sound good, you have to misrepresent it. You got to lie, okay? Because if you told the truth about it, okay, it wouldn't sound good. It would be impossible for it to sound good. So the only way you can make socialism, attractive is you got to lie about it. So using my illustrations now about my life, my liberty, my time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we are created in the image of God, if we have a spark of the divine, this is why biblically private property is looked upon as sacred.
Yes.
Private property is sacred, and this is why any form of collectivism, regardless of what it's called, because this is a tactic of the collectivists, is to confuse the lingo.
Yeah.
And say, well, socialism is okay, but fascism is awful, right?
Mm-hmm.
No, they're both collectivism. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Okay, they're both collectivism, right? And socialism is the left and fascism is the right. Well, no, actually, fascism's on the left too.
It's on the left.
They're both on the left, because collectivism is always on the left.
Because what people forget is fascism was known as two words: National Socialism. And socialism, the last I checked, falls on the left, not the right.
Yeah, always, right? But the point that you and I are making here, for people who may not have been aware, is that this is the background why socialism can never be biblical. It's not possible, and that is because private property biblically is sacred, and that socialism is rooted and grounded in the violation of the 10th commandment. It's actually rooted and grounded in the violation of the last 5 of the 10 commandments, all of them, which I'll explain that as we get deeper into it, because people are going, what do you mean murder is it? Well, it is. I hate to say that,
let me make a quick point before you move on, and that is when you look at when Jesus appeared on the scene, and this is something I know you know even better than I do in a lot of ways, but what I know is that when Jesus appeared on the scene some 2,000 years ago, he is in a country which is occupied by the Romans. Now, the Romans had gladiatorial games. They would kill people and animals for entertainment. There was no real value to human life. And even proceeding back, as you go back in time, you don't see a real value to human life. The very first time that you really see, number one, any kind of value given to human life, and God, even higher than that, being given a value to the individual, is not until you see Christianity hit the scene.
Correct.
And that is one of the reasons why I look at Christianity and say, no, there's no way that it can be socialist, because in socialism, the tenet is that the person is the property of the state, and that you are there for one thing, and that is to serve the state and the state's interests. You don't exist as an individual. You look at China, you look at some of the pictures that have come out, especially going back 20 years ago or more, everybody, it's unisex. It's one of the reasons why I think we have the transgenderism going on, is because that's actually a move to push societies into socialism, because there is no male or female in a socialist state. It is not the individual. It is something that serves the state, and you don't have any kind of individuality. People are dressed the same. They're expected to think the same, and everything is along those lines. Christianity comes along and puts a value on the individual. We've heard it said, or at least I have, that if you were the only person to ever believe in what Jesus did and the plan of salvation, that Jesus still would have been sent to the earth, still would have done everything he did in his life, still would have gone to the cross, still would have taken all the torture, and still would have been resurrected to save you, because you're worth as an individual that much to God. And that is the difference, in my mind, the biggest difference between socialism and true Christianity. But I just felt like I had to get that out there before we go forward.
Yeah, no, and once again, we agree that the Judeo-Christian world order, the Judeo-Christian worldview, as communicated through the Bible in both the Old and the New Testaments, that is what has changed the world. Whether the skeptics and critics and atheists want to admit it or not, because most of them don't, that the Judeo-Christian worldview is why humanity has not destroyed itself. It's just that simple. And that's, as we progress into the subject matter further here, I'm going to show that. I'm going to show how and why the human race is frankly going to destroy itself, and that the only solution is Judeo-Christianity. There is no other solution. But before we leave this thing about because we're not going to leave it, we're going to keep coming back to it. The illustration about the 10 commandments in reverse, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. I mentioned this, and I think it merits us going there for a second. I mentioned the fact that when you spell out the commandment, number 10, thou shalt not, I'm using the King James, right? Because that's how I memorized it as a kid, right? Thou shalt not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor, right? So this, and like I said, every word in scripture matters, right? Because, and now that's in the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, right? And then when you get to the New Testament and the New Covenant, you have Jesus having a discussion with his disciples and the Pharisees and Sadducees about who is my neighbor, defining who is your neighbor. See, so that is not just some random word thrown in for no reason whatsoever, right? And what I want to dovetail in here is the Shema. So the Shema is the first and great commandment. That's a prayer from the Old Covenant, from Deuteronomy, that the Hebrews learned and recite, every day. And the Shema, very simply, is thou shalt love the Lord thy God with thy whole heart, soul, and strength. And then when Jesus came, he modified it slightly. He added an additional word, heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? And if you're at all biblically aware, you're aware of the time when he was challenged by the religious leaders, and the religious leaders said, Master, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And then he recites the Shema, and he says, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with thy whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he follows it immediately by saying, and the second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, which is a quote from Leviticus. And then he wraps it up. He says, on these two hang all the law and the prophets. So very interesting that you've just got two commandments that really summarize everything. Love the Lord your God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then love your neighbor, key phrase, as yourself. Your neighbor.
And so all 613 things in the Torah all can hang like a mobile off of those two main points.
Absolutely. So love God, and then check it out. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. And that is a huge phrase that, frankly, needs to be unpacked a whole lot more in our churches and Bible studies. And is, what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? Because frankly, a lot of us don't know how to love ourselves very well. Right. We're not very good at that, because unfortunately, most churches emphasize loving God so much, right? That the love yourself and love your neighbor part, it's treated as a side issue, right? Yeah. When it comes to putting boots on the ground and practical application, that is critically important. But the point that I want to make about this is what's going on up here, right? And in here, because if you're supposed to love God and then love your neighbor as yourself, this all begins, here you go, it all begins by speaking the truth about God, about yourself, and about your neighbor. You cannot love God, love yourself, or love your neighbor when you are speaking or believing falsehood about God, yourself, or your neighbor. It's just not possible, okay? Because love, okay, which, we are followers of Jesus of Nazareth. He was the most loving man to have ever walked the earth, and we are encouraged to be like him, to love the way he loved, right? Well, and here it is. The summary is love God, love yourself, love your neighbor. If I'm going to love like Jesus, the only way I can do that is if I am walking in truth, understanding and speaking the truth about God, about myself, and also about my neighbor. It is not possible to love God, yourself, or your neighbor when you are, here you go, when you are believing lies.
Exactly.
Just not possible. And socialism is a lie. It is rooted and grounded in lies from the very beginning, because as what we're seeing here is that it's rooted and grounded in a violation of the 10th commandment. See, And the 10th commandment is thou shalt not covet, not even desire. Motivation. You're not even allowed to think about your neighbor's property, right? Let alone, and then like I said, see if you're seeing this part of the reason I bring it up is I said we're looking at a progression here. We're looking at the last 5, the second half of the 10 commandments, but in reverse order. Okay. And it begins with not desiring what belongs to your neighbor. Well, what's the next one? The next one is bearing false witness against your neighbor. The next one is thou shalt not lie. What am I talking about? What's the whole point I'm bringing up? Speaking the truth versus lying. Because what does socialism do? Socialism, the very next step after desiring what belongs to your neighbor, is to bear false witness against your neighbor. It's to lie about the nature of socialism. It's to lie about your neighbor and lie about yourself and create this paradigm where somehow you're entitled to something that isn't yours. That's what.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, I mean, that is how this works. So once again, for the listeners, I hope I am helping you see things in a new way, because it all boils down to this fulcrum. It's all about violating what is a very clear scriptural paradigm that private property is sacred. Okay. You're not even allowed to think the wrong thing about someone else's private property. And you're most assuredly not allowed to then invent a system that somehow, see, because what's next? It's covet what doesn't belong to you, then lie, and then steal. It's then take it, right?
There's a mental progression that takes place where each justifies the next step.
Exactly. And frankly, what we're talking about here is we are, ripping the veil away from socialism here, because what socialism is the systematization and codification of the violation of the 10 commandments. Okay. Yes, you heard that right. Socialism is the systematization and codification of the violation of the 10 commandments.
Amazing.
Yeah. And so so it's really, really, really clear to anybody who has eyes to see and ears to hear that socialism, it cannot be biblical. It is just simply not possible, right? It's not possible. Now, so what I'm doing here, I understand what I'm doing, and that is I'm taking all these so we had an illustration about, what's your most important, what's your most valuable possession, right? Your life, your liberty, your time, etc., your money. And what we did is we demonstrated how the Bible views private property and that private property is sacred, right? Then we added in this progression from the 10 commandments. So you've got a couple of big pieces of the puzzle, but believe it or not, they're not the only pieces. There's a couple more that I want to add in. I just want to give you the chance. Is there anything you want to say before I move to the next piece of?
No. Excellent so far. And I think this is what we're doing is so important, because people really need to understand and wrap their minds around what is happening in our society. It's been happening for a long time. It's all done through incrementalism, where it's little by little by little. We also call that the boiling frog principle, where we all know the story, right? You throw a frog into boiling hot water, it's going to, get right out immediately. But put a frog in that cool water and you slowly turn the temperature up, it's going to boil to death. It's not going to feel the increments of the temperatures increasing. And we're like that. And unfortunately, as much as socialism goes against human nature, those who try to implement it, they understand human nature and they know how to manipulate. And so we have to always be vigilant and be on the lookout for these sorts of things that we see happening in our society.
Well, this is exactly why we have a conversation, and exactly why I enjoy doing shows with you, Kevin, is because you set me up for the next segment perfectly.
That's my job. That's why I'm a host.
Yeah, I mean, you did. I mean, without even realizing, you dovetailed us right into the next segment, you know. So here we go. So listeners, play along. Here's what you got so far. You got the initial illustration about your most valuable possessions, your life, your liberty, your time, etc. Okay. Well, put that on the back burner for a second. Okay. Now, number 2, second illustration, 10 commandments in reverse. Not allowed to covet, not allowed to lie, not allowed to steal, not allowed to commit adultery. I'll get more into that in a minute. And then, of course, thou shalt not murder. You've got the second half of the 10 commandments, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6 in reverse order. Now take that one, put it on the back burner for a second, and let's throw in another illustration. And then this is why we're doing this, the format the way we are. We can talk for as long as we need to get all these puzzle pieces and then put them together. All right. So here we go. And by the way, I wanted to make one statement about, because you mentioned human nature, right?
Yes.
You got to, in order to make that illustration work, I'm not disagreeing with you, but in order to make that illustration work, you got to define human nature, right? So are you defining human nature as God defines it, or are you defining human nature as the world defines it? And in your illustration that you just used, ironically, the answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. In other words, what we're going to talk about even more and more as we get deeper into this is that, in my opinion, socialism doesn't violate human nature.
Mm-hmm.
It actually follows human nature. In other words, worldly human nature, and that's why it's a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
It's following fallen humanity's thinking. Right. But which is why the only way you can correct it, the only way you can fix it, is you have to insert God into the picture. You've got to insert God's paradigm into the picture to disrupt the human methodology. Okay. So now, like I said, we got a couple of things simmering on the back burner. Let's add another dish to the feast. And this dish is, I want to take just a second. We don't have to take a long time. I want to describe for the listeners the 5 primary components of religion. Okay. And we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to take this and we're going to put it on another burner, and then we're going to add another piece to the feast. Right. So the 5 main pieces to the religion puzzle are: number 1, the sacred space. And I'll define that in a second. Number 2, the holy man or woman, right? Number 3, the sacred code. Number 4, the holy day. And then number 5, the blood sacrifice. So if you examine the vast majority of world religions throughout human history, you will find these 5 components. It is very rare that you will not find exactly what I'm talking about. So number 1 is the sacred space. So a sacred space is a literal geophysical space that has been set aside for God's use or God's purposes, right? So we tend to call these spaces temples, shrines, churches, mosques, etc. That's what a sacred space is. If you go into the ancient religions, a sacred space could be a mountain, it could be a city, it could be a river, it could be a spot in the desert for that matter. And then you put a marker there to mark it, right? So it's, once again, it's a literal geophysical space that is set aside for God's purposes, God's use, however you want to phrase it, right? Mountain, city, river, spot in the desert, etc. And then over time, buildings that were dedicated to that purpose began to spring up, and we call those buildings temples, shrines, churches, mosques, etc., etc., etc. So you've got a literal geophysical sacred space, right? That's component number 1. Component number 2 is the holy man or the holy woman, right? Once again, now it's a similar concept, right? You have a person who is set aside for God's purposes or God's use, right? And they are different than everybody else. So using lingo that some people may be familiar with, this is where you get your concept of clergy and laity. Okay, so you've got your clergy over here, your religious officials over here, and then you have everyone else over there, your commoners over there. And usually the way it works is that the religious officials represent the commoners to God. They are the intermediary. They are the mediator between God and man, is the religious official. Okay. And then typically these religious officials are called shamans, medicine men, rabbi, imam, pastor, minister, priest. Really, the word that everybody would recognize would be priest, regardless of which potential religious background we're talking about here. Pretty much ultimately, they all have a priest of some type, and that usually he's the holy man, or priestess, the holy woman, right? Because religions throughout all human ages, there have been some that only men can be religious officials. There's others where only women can be religious officials, and there are some where both can be religious officials. Now, the male only obviously has dominated most societies and cultures, but the others have absolutely existed throughout human history, but they're the holy man, right? So like the sacred space, you've got a geophysical space that is different from all the rest because it's for God's use, right? Now you've got people that are different than everybody else because they are set aside for God's use, right? So you got sacred space, you got holy man. Number 3 is the sacred code or the sacred story. Okay. Now this can be exactly that. It can be a story, or it can be a list of commandments of code, right? So it can be they can be oral, okay, oral, spoken, or it can be written down, or both, right? So these are all of the sacred books and all the sacred stories we have. So you've got the Bible, obviously. You got the Old Testament, the New Testament. You got the Tanakh and the Brit Hadashah, right? Then you've got the Quran, of course, right? You've got the Hindu Vedas, right? And you've got all these different written records that are these holy books, these sacred codes. Then you also have oral tradition. The Nordic tradition for a long time was oral, not very much was written down. The Native American tradition was oral, and not much was written down. But you have this combination of sacred stories and sacred codes, oral tradition, written tradition, et cetera, et cetera. But the point being is that regardless of which religion you're looking at, you've got these 5 components: sacred space, holy man, sacred code. Now you have the holy day. Same principle again. Each of these principles, you've got the space that is set aside for God, and then all the rest. And then you've got the official that is set aside for God, and then you've got all the rest. Now you've got the special book that's set aside, and then you've got all the rest. Now you've got the special day, right? You got the special day. You've got and look in English, it's a holy day. If you contract it, that becomes holiday. That's where we get the word. It's a holy day, right? And all these different religions have certain days set aside for religious purposes. Okay? So it's pretty easy to understand.
You can even go all the way back to the book of Genesis, to where you had the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that was set aside.
Well, yeah. The garden is a sacred space.
Yeah.
There's no question.
It goes all the way back to the very beginning. This is, ubiquitous.
I actually wrestled with this for years until one day the light came on where I went, oh, yeah, the garden. The garden is a sacred space. Mm-hmm. Okay. It is the sacred space where God and humanity meet. And what God is doing in the book of Genesis is he's setting up Adam and Eve as the priest and priestess, the caretakers of the sacred space.
It's all there. It's all there.
Yeah. Right. So it's right there. So finally, the last piece of the puzzle is the blood sacrifice. Okay.
Right.
So the way it works, and we'll use the biblical example because the biblical example is right in our face, right? Is the way it works is you put all 5 components together. The holy man offers the blood sacrifice in the sacred space on the holy day according to the sacred code. There it is. Now you got religion in a nutshell. The sacred man, the holy man, offers the blood sacrifice in the sacred space on the holy day according to the sacred code. There you go. So go ahead. Ta-da, right?
Yeah.
So now the preeminent example of this in Scripture is the Day of Atonement.
Yeah.
So for listeners who may not be aware, it's very simple. This was the one day of the year that the high priest, there it is, see, the one day of the year, the holy day, the Day of Atonement in the Hebrew religion is considered the holiest day of the year. So here you go, right? So there's your holy day, right? And then the high priest, there's your holy man. And he's not just any priest, he's the high priest, right? So you've got the holy day, you got the holy man, and then what he would do is he would enter into the temple structure, and then within the temple you have increasingly you got concentric circles that go to the holy place, right? So you've got the outer court, then you have the holy place, and then you have the Holy of Holies, and then behind the veil was the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
And what the high priest would do is he would literally carry blood with him into the holy place, behind the veil, into the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant was, and he would literally dip his finger in the blood and then sprinkle it on what's called the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant. So,
right.
I mean, so there it is. So in the Jewish religion, right, you've got your sacred space, you got your holy man, you've got your sacred code, you've got your holy day, and then you've got your blood sacrifice. Now, if we were focusing on Christianity, we would follow through with this illustration, and what we would do is we'd go into the scripture, and I'd go into the gospels, and I would point out at bare minimum 5 different verses that say, well, guess what? Jesus is the temple. Yeah. So Jesus is the sacred space, right? Mm-hmm. Then I would point out that Jesus is a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Yeah, so he is the holy man, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Jesus is the Word. The Word became flesh and was tabernacled among us. So he is the sacred code, right? Then he is, and then Book of Hebrews, Jesus is our Sabbath rest. He is our holy day, right? And then finally, he's the Lamb of God. I mean, come on, it doesn't get more obvious, okay, than this, that Jesus fulfilled all 5. He is the sacred space. He's the temple of God. He is the holy man. He's the high priest. He is the Word of God, the incarnate Word of God. He is our Sabbath rest. He is our holy day. And then he is the ultimate sacrifice.
Right.
Okay. Then, if you take it one step further and you go into the Pauline epistles, right, that are written to followers of Jesus of Nazareth, you will find out where it says, oh, yeah, by the way, you are the temple of God. You are kings and priests, right? You have the law of the Spirit of Christ living within you, right? The law of the Spirit of God in Christ Jesus within you. So in other words, the Word is written on your heart, okay? Then every day, because of the accomplished work of Christ, is a holy day, right? And it was a one-time blood sacrifice. That one actually just goes away. We don't offer blood sacrifice anymore. We celebrate the Lord's Supper to commemorate the blood sacrifice. So this is how religion is dealt with in Scripture. Is you've got an old covenant religion, then you've got the reality being fulfilled in the life and ministry of Christ. And then you've got an even deeper reality now in followers of Christ this is what it means when you hear preachers and teachers and ministers say, Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. Well, that's because if you follow this paradigm, the religious practices have been done away and it's now all internal. Okay. Know ye not that you are the temple of God, right? You are a priest and a king. The law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus dwells within you, the law of God written on your heart, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, so once again, remember what we're doing here. We have put several things in pots on the stove simmering. So we got our initial illustration of your valuable possession, your life, your liberty, your time. We got our second illustration of the 10 Commandments in reverse. Do not covet, do not lie, do not steal, do not commit adultery, do not kill. And then now we have this additional illustration of these are the components to religion. These are the components to religion, because what we're going to get into now is, well, where did religion come from? Right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of people are going to be tempted to say, well, it came from God, right? Maybe, maybe not. Okay. Because what you see in scripture an awful lot is, and I'm just going to give away the punchline and then we'll describe it. What you see an awful lot in scripture is humanity having an idea, right? And then God intervening and saying, okay, that might be a good idea, but why don't you do it like this? See, that may not be the best idea. Maybe it's a good idea, maybe not the best idea.
And so, Tim,
yeah, go ahead.
With the thing that comes to mind, even though it's maybe not strictly religious, is Israel was saying, well, all these other countries have a king. Why can't we have a king?
Right. Good example.
So God said, okay, you want a king? You're going to regret it. You're not going to like it, but here's how you're going to do it.
You are absolutely correct. There are several examples of that throughout scripture. That's one of them. The one that I happen to be thinking of was the idea to build a temple. Was not God's idea. It was David's idea. It was a man-made idea. David thought to himself, let's build a house for God. God didn't say, David, build me a house. David came up with that idea. Read the record. It's very, very clear. But then what happened and Nathan even goes to David and says, don't do it. Don't do it. Please don't do it. That's not God's idea. Don't do it. Right. And then when God realizes he can't talk David out of it, that's when God steps in and goes, okay, fine. If you're going to do it, then you're going to do it my way. And you're going to build it like this. And it's going to look like this. Okay. Right. So, but you're correct. That is a very common thing throughout scripture where the humans come up with an idea that they think is really cool. Right. And maybe not so much. Right.
Yeah.
And God steps in and goes, okay. Right. Let's do it like this. Okay. Right. So now we have several pots simmering on the stove. Let's add another one. Right. Now, this gets deep fast. And if it's unfamiliar, I will do my best to explain this very simply and not, get bogged down. Right. The fancy words for what I'm about to describe it is called the Mimetic Sequence, right? And if your listeners are at all familiar with this, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. What I'm talking about here is primarily the work of a man named Rene Girard. Now, Rene Girard is no longer with us. He passed away about 5-7 years ago, somewhere in that neighborhood. The quick story of Rene Girard, try to do this very quickly. He was born in the 1920s in southern France, which means he reached adulthood in Nazi-occupied France. He went to college to be an historian. He got a job working with historical documents, and he realized that was a little too dull and boring for him. So he packed up and moved from France to the United States, where he started doing his postgraduate work. I believe it was at Indiana University. And then, as graduate students do, you usually get a job teaching in the university while you're working on your PhD, right? So because he is a native French speaker, even though he is doing his PhD work in history and anthropology and things like that, the job he gets is teaching college level French, right? Because he speaks French and he speaks English well enough that he's going to teach French to college.
And he's a native speaker.
Right, he's a native speaker. Plus, at college level, I don't know if you've ever taken a foreign language at college level. Usually,
I have a hard enough time with English.
Right. Well, I dabbled with it. I didn't do well. I mean, I took a couple foreign languages in high school, and then I tried to in college.
Yeah.
And in college, it didn't really work that well. But generally speaking, in college, when you're taking college level foreign language, it's presumed you're actually already conversant in the language. Okay. So a lot of times you walk into college level French, for example, and they're just talking in French. You're not going to hear any English, right? But the reason the story is fun is this. Rene Girard was given a curriculum, and that curriculum included reading French novels, because if you're conversant, the whole point here now is to get you, instead of always translating every sentence in your head and doing the work twice, to think in the language that you're speaking, right? So if you're going to learn to speak French, you need to learn to think in French, right? So therefore, the whole point of this exercise was to get the students reading French novels. Okay, pretty simple, right? What Rene Girard very freely admits, if you read his work, is that, he was a week in front of his students. He hadn't read the novels either. And, now it's an assigned part of the curriculum. And, he's 2 chapters up, and that's it. Right. But what they would do is they would read the novels, and then they would discuss the novels. And then, so that's the whole idea, to get you to think in French. Right. And then as they would discuss the novels, you'd have these questions. And one of the questions was, what is the difference between this novel and this novel? And they would discuss the distinctions. And one day he just got this wild idea, and he flipped the question. He said, you know what? Let's not talk about what's different. Let's talk about what's the same. And what he tripped into without realizing it is he tripped into his calling, is really what it boils down to. He tripped into what became his predominant work, which is that what he noticed is that this book over here maybe was about this character in this place and this time, and then this book over here was about this character in this place and this time, but that the underlying stories were remarkably similar. The details may have been different place, different time, different language, different setting, different culture, but that the underlying stories were the same, right? Or very similar, I should say, right? And so what he did is began his research into comparing European novels. That's what he started doing. Is it started with
this
modern,
would be where you get your comparative literature from.
Comparative literature, right? So this falls under the category of comparative literature. But what he realized was he started out with, modern, contemporary French novels, right? But then he started including all of the classical European novels, right? So Dostoevsky and, Flaubert and, all these guys, right? And realized that these, can you hear me?
Yeah, on a humorous note,
yes,
people will compare the Disney kids film Ferngully to the movie Avatar, and
sure.
They notice that they're like almost identical. The stories are almost identical.
Absolutely. Well, because what he discovered is and the men and women that have delved into this very deeply have come to realize that there really only are about a half a dozen stories, period, in the existence of all humanity. Every story is a variation of one of these 8, 10, 12, but 12
It's
max.
a variation of a theme.
Yeah, there's these fundamental stories, and that's it. Everything after that is just a variation. So anyway, to run through the Rene Girard story really quickly, is that so he started comparing and contrasting classical European novels, because what he wanted to see, what he wanted to make sure what he was seeing was not a fluke, because they read a couple of novels and went, wow, wait a second. Different character, different place, different setting, different language, but the story's the same, right? So what he wanted to do was make sure that wasn't some fluke. So now he includes all these classical European novels, and guess what he finds? Same thing, different place, different language, different setting, different culture, same story, right? So then he included Shakespeare in his research, discovered the same thing.
Really?
Different place, different time, same stories.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And what's interesting about Shakespeare is I know you've probably heard this, they don't think that William Shakespeare actually wrote the stuff.
Right.
Because it had to be somebody deeply connected into the inner workings of the king's courts, because whoever wrote that knew exactly how they operated and a commoner wouldn't.
Different discussion for a different day.
Different discussion, but just sort of throw that out there.
But yeah, a unique point. But follow the progression here, because you know where this is going, right?
Oh yeah.
It started with modern French novels, then it included classical European novels, then he threw in Shakespeare, then he threw in Greek and Roman mythology. And guess what
you see the same cycle.
Same thing, right? So once again, it's just a snowball is just going and going and going and going, right? So modern French novels, classical European novels, Shakespeare, Greek and Roman mythology. Okay, what's left? The Bible.
The Bible, yeah.
The Bible. So Rene Girard, because he never intended to go there initially, apparently, right? So finally, he doesn't have any choice. He's got to go there. And so what is he? Because Rene Girard's gift was that he could see the layers of the story beyond just the surface level story. That was his gift. He could just see in the
He would just see it.
He could just see it, right? So now what does he do? But he says, okay, well, guess what? I got to include the Bible in my research, right? And he discovered the same thing. So this goes back to the illustration that we've been frankly making all along.
Mm-hmm.
This is human nature, because that's exactly what Rene Girard discovered, is that authors are extraordinary observers of human nature because they write it into their work without even realizing it. See, so that's kind of an interesting insight about whether Shakespeare did or did not write the works credited to him. It almost doesn't matter, because whoever wrote them had this insight into human nature. That's the thing, because now that you know what to look for, you can look for, because I see, like you mentioned, the fact that kids will compare movies and adults will compare movies. I do it all the time, where I compare this movie to that movie and go, yeah, see, that's that same thing, you're right.
Yep.
But once again, the point being is you really only have somewhere between a half a dozen and a dozen stories, and everything else is a variation on the story. It's a different place, different time, different lead character. Is the main character a man or a woman? Is the main character one guy or two guys? And those are the variations, right? So once again, we got several pots simmering around the stove. So let's add another one. Okay. So to get through this material quickly, let's play along. I want you to imagine in your head a 2-year-old playing in a room filled with toys. And she's sitting in there and she's playing with a toy, and she's just as happy as can be, got her toys and a room full of toys, and it's all good. Okay. Now, what we do is we take another 2-year-old and we put that 2-year-old in the room with the first 2-year-old. what is going to happen?
They could fight.
Not
Hey,
could.
this is my toy. No, that's my toy. I was playing with that.
Boom. Nailed it. Thank you, Kevin. This is why you are the host. Okay. Because you just went right to it. Because here's what's now. So let me describe in detail what's going to happen, right? World War III is about to break out. And the reason World War III is going to break out is because there's going to be something going on internally in the two children, period, because it's human nature and it's internal and it's going to happen.
Right.
It's going to happen, which is when you introduce that second toddler into the situation, they are going to notice whichever toy is closest to the first toddler. Because the fact that it is sitting nearest to the other toddler, that indicates value. That must be the most valuable toy in the room because it is closest to the other toddler. Okay, so now let me introduce a word that we've been using already. Because that toy appears to be the most valuable, that makes that toy the most desirable. Ooh, desire. Covet.
Yeah, interesting.
Covet. So what is the second toddler going to do? The second toddler is going to reach out to pick up that toy, right? Now, for illustration purposes, let's say that the toy, it's not the toy that the other toddler is playing with. It's simply the toy sitting closest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's just sitting there, well, it's free for me to pick it up, right? See?
Mm-hmm.
So what they do is they reach over and they pick it up. As soon as they reach over to pick it up, it is the first toddler is now processing the exact same message because the second toddler is reaching to pick it up. It is sending the internal message that is the most desirable toy in the room. See where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So what you've got is you've got an internal mimicking going on. This is where we get what is called the mimetic sequence because it's all imitation and it's all internal. They're not consciously going, well, let's see here. What's the most important toy in the room? And no, it's all internal. And because it's sitting closest to the first toddler, that sends the message that's the most desirable toy in the room.
And also people have a tendency to want what they can't have.
Boom. Boom. You are all over it, my friend. So
and I worked in sales, and there's techniques where you take the sale away to gauge how much does the person want what you're selling.
Right. Well, Kevin, once again, this is why you're the host. You're just all over it. Okay. Because look at marketing, right?
Yeah.
Look at marketing. I want you to buy this brand of t-shirts, not because it's a better t-shirt. I want you to buy it because Michael Jordan wears it.
Yeah.
Okay. Celebrity endorsement unconsciously communicates desire.
Right.
This thing is desirable, not because it's better than the other one. No, it's because so-and-so wears it or so-and-so uses it.
And you're getting into behavior. And here's the thing. I don't know if you ever heard of the 5 monkeys study that was done, the 5 monkeys.
Remind me.
Let me explain. They put 5 monkeys into a room, and then they had a big ladder, and up on top of the tall ladder, they put their favorite foods that these monkeys would want to eat. And the first couple of days, there would be a routine established. They would put the food up there, and you know what would happen. Monkeys will go right up there like nobody's business, and they're eating and everything else. Then a day came where they put a fire hose on every monkey that went up there to get the food. They stopped going up there, even though the most desirable food was sitting right there. They wouldn't go up there because they knew they'd get blown off there with a high stream, fast moving pitch of water. They removed one of the monkeys. They put a new monkey in. Now that new monkey hasn't experienced anything the other four have. What do you think that new monkey's going to do? There's exactly what I want that's up there. He's taking off to go up the ladder. The other monkeys are grabbing him and pulling him down to keep him from going up there.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're controlling behavior.
Exactly. So if you're following our illustration here, the listeners, the viewers, if you're following this illustration, go back to our 2-year-olds for a second, right? Whatever toy is closest to the first 2-year-old, the second one's going to reach out and try to take it. Well, as soon as that happens, that's communicating the same message to the first toddler. Well, that's the most. So what they're going to do is they're going to try to stop them. They're going to reach out and go, oh, no, mine.
Yep.
Right. See,
and that was mine. I was playing with that.
Right. I was playing with that. I saw it first. Right. So now when the first toddler snatches it away, that just amplifies the desirability again.
Oh, yeah.
So everything about this ramps up and amplifies the mimetic, the imitative behavior. It's subconscious, it's unconscious. They're not making this decision in their head. They're not calculating and going, well, I think I'm going to get upset about the fact that this other toddler took the blocks.
Yeah, because toddlers aren't going to think that deeply.
No. Well, even adults don't think that deeply. Because this is a behavior pattern that doesn't go away. It is ingrained into us. Okay? So here's what's going to happen. Second toddler reaches for it. First toddler snatches it. Second toddler tries to grab it, and then World War III breaks out, and you've got to fight over the toy, right? All you need to do is take this scenario and substitute certain other concepts, and you have the adult version of the exact same thing. The classic. Ready?
That was my island. No, I was there. That's my island. No, that's my piece of land. No, we were here first.
We were here first, right? But so land is a great example. There's a couple other really, really good examples where you can see it in your head really easily. Yeah. Another very classic example is two men fighting over the same woman.
Right.
Okay. And because it's internal. It's internal. See? So if you've got a girl that I find attractive, I will try to do something to get the girl, right? But as soon as you see me do it, it's not just the I had it first, although that plays a significant role. It's not just the I had it first thing. It's that my desirability, my expression of desire ramps up your desire. See, it's that back and forth mimetic. The scientists have actually done extensive research on this to the degree that they have now identified the neurons in the brain that execute this sequence, and they call it the mirror neuron because it mirrors it just automatically does what the other person does, right? And see, most of the time, the mirror neuron is used to learn, right? This is how children learn. They learn by imitation, right? They don't.
And the Bible even says that, be like little children, be imitators of Christ.
Right. You're not wrong. But see, this is why children learn by imitation. They don't. Once again, they're not calculating. Calculating doesn't come online until they're 7 or 8 years old.
You know, it's funny because I was talking about this with my wife the other day. One of my earliest memories, I must be like 4 years old, and I'm copying the way my father is stretched out on the floor with his hand on his head and his elbow on the floor, and he's horizontal on his side. And we're both sitting there watching when the original series of Star Trek, he had that on, and I'm copying my father. And I can't remember my mother walking out of the kitchen into the living room and having a chuckle.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely.
Yep, absolutely. So anyway, so now you can see what you've got here is what Rene Girard describes as the mimetic sequence, right? Okay, so so whatever the object of desire is, once two people or more, right, demonstrate their desire for that object, the other person's desire is going to get amplified automatically, internally, subconsciously. Okay. So what you're going to have is mimetic imitation, is mimetic desire is then going to ramp up into mimetic conflict. Okay. Now here's the funny part. Once the conflict starts to take over, the imitation doesn't stop. In other words, if it's two guys fighting over a girl,
that's
right?
hardwired. That's hardwired.
Well, it's not just that it's hardwired, but watch this carefully, right? Because at first it's, you got a girl that I find attractive, so I do something stupid and I make a move, right? You push back, okay? And at first you're not even angry. You're just like, dude, go away, right? But what that does is that ramps up the desire in me, okay? Which, because it ramps up the desire in me, it ramps up the desire in you. So now this time when you push back with some anger, okay? The mimetic component of this means now I ramp up the anger. See? And once again, it's subconscious, it's unconscious. See? Because it's imitation. So desire will morph into conflict, and then the conflict will morph into violence.
Yeah.
Okay? Is what's going to happen here. And so now just to kind of jump to the end, and all of this can happen in a blink. This doesn't mean you need to take, hours or days or weeks to get there. This can happen in 5 minutes. Where it will go from simple desire to conflict to violence in no time.
In a millisecond.
Yeah, in a millisecond, right? So now that you know what to look for, we've got examples in the Bible.
Yeah.
Okay. Because like I said, what Rene Girard found was he found this. This is one of the things he found. He found the mimetic sequence in all these European novels, Shakespeare, Greek myth, everything. It's all there. I mean,
well, you can go all the way back to Adam and Eve with the serpent in the garden saying, look, God's holding out on you.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. The two examples that I usually start with are not that one. That's a great example.
Yeah.
But two examples that I usually start with that everybody can recognize is Cain and Abel.
Right.
Okay. And David and Uriah.
Yes.
Okay. Because we are told.
Excellent examples.
Yeah. Because what does David do? He kills
Uriah by putting him on the front lines.
Kevin, he kills him.
Yeah.
He murders him to get what belongs to him. So here you go, right? Number one, he desired what was not his.
Right.
Number two, he bore false witness against his neighbor. Number three, he took what was not his. Number four, he committed adultery. Number five, he murdered him.
Yeah.
It's right there. The second half of the 10 Commandments in reverse. And it's right there in our face. So what this is a deeply embedded component of human nature, okay, that we will engage in. Because of the mirror neuron, this is automated. Okay. It is going to happen. It's not if, it's when. See, so and it can happen on any scale. It can be two toddlers fighting over some colored blocks. It can be two guys fighting over a woman. It can be two brothers fighting over their father's blessing. Gee, does that sound familiar?
That sounds awfully familiar.
That sounds awfully familiar. Or it can be two nations fighting over land.
Yeah. Which isn't in the news at all today.
Which, I mean.
No, not at all. Doesn't ring a bell.
Doesn't ring a bell, right? Exactly. So obviously for you listeners out there, Kevin and I are being very sarcastic because we're talking about the promised land, the land of Canaan that was promised to Abraham and his descendants. And what you've got going on here is the mimetic sequence on a global scale. The mimetic sequence on a global scale. So now, once again, back to our illustrations, we've got multiple pots all simmering on the stove. And now we're starting to see how these are interconnected, right? Because I just spelled it out for you that the mimetic sequence, if it is allowed to just run its course, right, it will break the second half of the 10 Commandments in order every time, right? Now, a quick word of explanation about commandment number 7, which is thou shalt not commit adultery. That doesn't mean that in the mimetic sequence, every time someone engages in the mimetic sequence, there's going to be like sexual adultery. What you have to insert there is it's covenant breaking, is what it is. It's covenant breaking.
It's not the act per se. That's what manifests from the principle.
Yeah, it's covenant breaking. So now, though, the second half, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6 are do not covet what belongs to your neighbor. Keyword. Number 2, do not bear false witness about your neighbor. In other words, don't rationalize. Don't tell lies about him. Rationalize what comes next, which is I'm going to take what belongs to him. Then I'm going to break covenant with him. And then finally, I'm just going to flat out kill him. See, there it is, right?
Yeah.
So now, once again, so like I said, now we've got several pots boiling at the same time. Let's add another illustration, right? Because what I described to you is what is going on between, like, you and me over the girl, right? Okay. But then in some other area of my life and in some other area of my community, maybe it's you and I going back and forth over a girl, but maybe it's me and this other guy going back and forth over a business deal. And then it's that guy and another guy going back and forth over this other thing. And then it's this woman and that woman and that woman and that. And what happens is now you've got multiple examples within a community of mimetic sequence all going on at the same time. Okay. Now, what you got to do is you got to take yourself and you got to transport yourself back into the ancient world for a second. Okay. You got to go back 1,000 years, 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, and imagine you're living in some small village, right? Several hundred people, maybe a couple thousand, right? But it's a small village, and they don't know anything about this internal sequence. They don't know the science behind it or the behavior, right? All they know is that the entire village is on edge, right? And it just seems like the whole village is just ready to explode, right? And then if you add in something like a natural disaster, you add in something like a storm or an earthquake or a plague or something like that. Now this community, this village, they're just going to be, the fuse has been lit. It's going to blow up any second. And what you're going to have is you're going to have multiple examples of mimetic violence. People are going to start dying, right? So what do you do about it? Well, you got to interrupt the mimetic sequence. That's what goes on here, is in some way, shape, or form, you've got to interrupt this sequence. So this is what would very typically happen in the ancient world. And frankly, it still does. Go ahead.
Here's the deal. What you're talking about is sequencing. If we go back to roughly 2,500 years ago to Plato in his writing called The Republic talked about the quote third way. Now the third way, he talked about this, and then a guy by the name of Hegel came along in the 1800s. Same exact thing. We call it the Hegelian dialectic.
Yep.
It's the exact same thing. And it's a synthesis and the antithesis. And the third way, as Plato put it, or the dialectic, is that you're kind of like, you have a tube of toothpaste and you want to get the toothpaste out of the tube onto your toothbrush. So what do? You press from above and below. The squeezing principle is going to create a third way, which is going to cause the toothpaste to come out onto your brush. And it's a way to direct human nature, because you're going to, and the way you stop the dialectic is first you create the problem, okay, which is what Plato identified 2,500 years ago. Hegel reinvigorated it. Problem created, you get the outcry, you put in the solution that you already wanted to do, but you know would never be tolerated in the first place. So what does that mean? That means that the process can be started if the people who are the target of it don't react in the way that they expect.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well,
so,
once again,
a really good example that I heard a woman at a conference give about this, which was Charlotte Iserby, the late Charlotte Iserby. Years ago, she said, look, if I wanted to get out of having to launder all of my husband's clothes, I would take all of his whites, throw in some of my red blouses and things, and all of his stuff would come out pink. And he'd say, you know what? You're not going to do the laundry for me anymore. I'll do it. She didn't want to do it to begin with. She didn't have to approach him to say, honey, you do your own laundry. Now he's willing to do it because she created the problem. And that's a very mundane, very easy example, but governments have been doing this for thousands of years. Mm-hmm. Religions, you name it. People of any kind of, quote, authority will do this in order to steer the masses in the direction that they want to take them, even if that's not the direction that the masses want to go.
Right. So once again, you're setting me up perfectly.
Yeah.
So here we go. So now, once again, put on your imagination glasses, and I want you to imagine you're in, the ancient world, right? It's at least 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, and you're in a small village, and you're one of the people, right? And the town is just ready to blow up, right? And like I said, you've added in a natural disaster or something like that, and it's just the whole town is on edge. So what do? You find a member of your community. Actually, it's better to find someone who is on the margins of your community, and you blame them. Okay. In other words, what you're doing is you're finding a scapegoat, right? So typically what would be done would be to find someone who is marginalized in some way anyway, right? So it would very frequently be a woman, right? A minority, a foreigner, someone of a lower class, or something like that, right? So you pick a target, and then you dehumanize them. And you do that by accusing them of a crime that is truly inhumane. Murder isn't good enough. It's got to go way beyond that. It's got to be child murder, or witchcraft, or it's got to be something truly heinous, because what you're going to do is you're going to dehumanize that person and make them not human. Because what you do then is it's a scapegoat. We already know this, and people, the listeners, can know where this is going now. But this is how you interrupt mimetic violence in the world. In the worldly system, this is how you interrupt mimetic violence, is you find a scapegoat, okay, and then you kill him. All right? You find a scapegoat, you blame everything on the scapegoat, and then you execute the scapegoat. And because you have convinced the entire community that the scapegoat is the problem, guess what happens when you kill the scapegoat? Problem goes away, at least temporarily. Doesn't go away forever. Oh no. No.
You come up with a new scapegoat class.
Exactly, because what's going to happen is because this is internal, right, and automatic, it's going to happen again. It's going to happen again. So oh, wait a second, you and me, we live in this ancient little village and we executed someone, 3 years ago. And now all of a sudden the village is all up in arms and ready to explode again. If we do it again, no one's ever going to come to our village again because the word's going to get around. Yeah, you know what they do? They kill people there. If you're on the margins, see, because what will happen is it won't take very long and you'll be able to start to see through this thing, right? So what you've got to do now is you've got to camouflage it. You have to camouflage it and turn it into something else. Because if you camouflage it, you can keep doing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what you do is you create a memory of this time and this place when there was this thing that happened that solved all of our problems. So on this day, this person was executed by so-and-so, and they did it over there. So we're going to put a marker at that spot. And then every year we're going to remember what happened because our town was cleansed of the evil that occurred, And if you haven't picked, I know you have, but listeners, if you haven't picked it up just yet, I just described the sacred space because we're going to commemorate where it happened. We're going to put a marker at the sacred space. And then the holy man, that's the executioner who murdered the blood sacrifice. And then what we do is we commemorate the day. There's our holy day. And then we write it down and we commemorate it. There's our sacred story and our sacred code.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So the point being here is that this is the human origin of religion.
Mm-hmm.
This is the human origin of religion. And this is where it gets ugly, ladies and gentlemen. Extraordinarily huge portions of human nature and human society and human culture are rooted and grounded in collective murder.
Mm-hmm.
That's who we are. And this is why I said earlier in the program, I can demonstrate to you that the human race is going to destroy itself. Because you can't stop this. Or the only way to stop it, okay, is to create a religion, okay, that commemorates murder.
It's interesting, too, because I've heard it said that, most of your people that get into positions of power and authority, they're more or less psychopaths or they're sociopaths. Now, that's a little off the beaten path of what we're talking about, but I'm going to connect it back in. So what happens is they decide and do the things that you're talking about, and then we have to get to a point where we have to be able to stand up to that type of person because, as you're saying, they will keep wiping each other out, Tim, until you maybe have just two of them left. And they're both on their pile of crap that they're going to defend. And one's going to kill the other. You're going to have one left. And that one is so neurotic and so, what's the word I'm looking for? Like Nero syndrome, that he's going to kill himself because he's no longer happy. Narcissism. Thank you. Such a narcissist at that point that the only thing left to do is kill himself.
Yeah.
And then we're exactly what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. All right. So the obvious question becomes, well, what is there a real solution? And if there is a real solution, what is it? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, ironically, the solution is right in front of us. It's just you got to lift the veil in order to see it. Okay. What Rene Girard discovered in his research as he compared modern French novels to European novels, to Shakespeare, to Greek and Roman myth, and then finally to the Bible, is he found that basically the exact same story is hidden in every one of these texts. But he also discovered that the Bible is different. The Bible tells the story, but it modifies certain pieces of the puzzle that make an enormous difference. And it changed his life. It changed Rene Girard from a very unconvinced Christian, right? He was raised culturally Christian, culturally Roman Catholic, actually, but he never really did anything with it until his research led him to delve deeply into the Bible, and it changed everything, right? So to help the listeners out, let me just explain it, okay? Because in that worldly mimetic sequence, right, the way you interrupt mimetic violence is with a blood sacrifice. Okay? It's with a collective murder, because there it is, right? You scapegoat someone and then you murder them. So human culture is rooted and grounded in collective violence and collective murder. But like we said, you can't keep doing that every year. So what you do is you commemorate it, right, with the sacred space, the holy man, the sacred code, the holy day, and then what you do is you sacrifice an animal instead. See, you kill a goat, right, or a sheep or a cow or something. So this is the origin of blood sacrifice around the world. It's where it came from. This is where every culture in the world, every ancient religion in the world practiced blood sacrifice. And frankly, this is why many, many, many cultures in the ancient world practiced human sacrifice, is because that was considered this extraordinary honor, right, to solve your community's problem. See? If once again, if we've got our community, right, and we've got our annual celebration where we're going to offer sacrifice to the gods who are going to solve our problems, right? So we've collected up all of our animals. We got 50 cattle and we got 200 sheep and we got 400 goats. But then you, believe it or not, you will get cultures where humans will volunteer to go be the human sacrifice to solve their problem, right?
And I think it was the Aztecs or the Mayans, I forget which, but they would sacrifice the captured enemy soldiers.
Yeah, that was very, very, very common. Very common to sacrifice your enemies, your enemies, your slaves, the captive. But you also had cultures where people would volunteer.
They volunteered, right? And they were greatly honored and blah, blah, blah.
But the point being is that this was how you atoned for by the blood sacrifice, right? But here's the key. The key to understanding it is that in these ancient cultures, they truly believed that the scapegoat was the problem. They really believed it. That witch over there, who isn't a witch, we've just accused her of being a witch. That witch over there, she's the problem. She's the problem. Therefore, we execute her, the problem goes away, right? But in the Bible, you see a shift. And the shift is the scapegoat. Where did that label come from? That label comes from the Bible, right? Because the scapegoat on the Day of Atonement, right? The high priest would lay his hands, like this, by the way, on the head of the goat, and he would confess the sins of the nation onto the goat. And then the goat would be sent into the wilderness. Here is the critical distinction. That high priest is acknowledging the sins of the community. That's a very different perspective than what we're talking about. The other perspective, where the scapegoat's the problem.
it comes down to the adage, excuse me, comes down to the adage there, what you're saying, to sum it up succinctly, is you can either fix the problem or you can fix the blame.
Yep. That's part of it.
That's exactly what you're describing.
Right. Well, here we go. Because this is biblical, it's going to go further. It's going to go deeper. Right. So here you go. Your worldly version of this is that you find a scapegoat, you blame the scapegoat, you kill the scapegoat. Okay. Then you commemorate killing the scapegoat. Right. And there's your religion. Done. Now, what we do is we get together once a year or once a month or once a week or whatever, and we commemorate the execution
There you go. Yeah.
of the scapegoat, right? That is pretty much all world religions in a nutshell. But what Rene Girard discovered was, whoa, wait a second, time out. The Bible doesn't do that. It's different. The Bible is different. The Bible describes the high priest confessing the sins of the people on the goat. He's acknowledging it's not, the scapegoat isn't the problem. We're the problem.
We're the problem.
We're the problem. So the Bible is completely different.
Yeah.
Completely different than all these other stories. And that's what Rene Girard discovered. Okay. Then it gets even better, because the real question is, who does the scapegoat represent? The scapegoat represents Jesus. Because in Jesus here, wonderful, beautiful distinction. Here in the old covenant, the high priest confessed the sins of the nation and put them on the goat, and then went and killed the goat, sent the goat into the wilderness to die. Right. Jesus, the scripture says, became sin. Became sin. So what that is acknowledging is acknowledging the fact that sin is a form of corruption that came upon the human race and the creation due to Adam's fall. When Adam sinned, the human race and the whole creation inherited this kind of corruption. And now what Scripture is acknowledging is that Jesus came and said, I will, quote unquote, become sin for you.
To do what you cannot do.
To do what, there you go, to do what you cannot do. And here you go. And remove the problem. Remove it. See, all the others, it's just this bizarre cathartic experience because we feel better because we killed the scapegoat. We didn't actually remove the problem, because in the worldly version, they're not even really acknowledging that they're the problem. They're blaming the scapegoat. The scapegoat's the problem, right? At least in Old Testament Judaism, they're acknowledging that, no, we're the problem, and we're going to place all of it on the scapegoat and send the scapegoat into the wilderness.
Right.
Followers of Christ recognize, we inherited the corruption from our great grandfather, and Jesus has solved the problem by becoming sin for us. And here's the thing, very widely misunderstood in Christianity. We didn't, in a manner of speaking, we did execute Jesus, make no mistake. And in that story, right, the religious leaders, they were totally scapegoating Jesus. They were making him the problem, right? But in the bigger picture, Jesus is not a sacrifice offered by humanity to appease an angry God. Jesus is a sacrifice offered by God to appease angry humanity.
Right. It's always the reverse.
Yeah. And so my point being here, and we can wrap up, we can continue, we can keep talking about this, but now for the listeners, what you need to do is you need to take all of the different pots that I've laid out on the stove that we have simmering here, and you need to put them all together and look at what's going on around us in the world in light of what I have shown you. This is how human behavior works on automatic pilot unless you interrupt it.
See, because I've always said that human nature is quantifiable. You can predict it.
Yeah.
And I believe that the powers that shouldn't be, let's put it that way, they know that too and know how to manipulate, because they know how an individual, and it gets more dumbed down when you deal with a larger group of people, they know how that group is going to react for the most part, and they're almost always right.
Right. So my point being here to help out the listeners is what I'm encouraging people to do is to look at current affairs through this viewfinder. The
land, people, etc.
Yeah, well, you know, that what's your most valuable possession, your life, your liberty, your time, that private property is sacred, that you are not allowed to even desire what doesn't belong to someone else, because if you do, here's what's going to happen. If you don't respect private property, then mimetic conflict, mimetic desire, mimetic conflict, and mimetic violence will happen. It will happen. And then what will happen in response is usually the scapegoating of somebody. We're going to blame someone by dehumanizing them. I mean, come on, let's just, I don't have any choice but to go there. This is why the world right now is rushing to blame Israel for the problem. Okay. It's because we did it once in World War I. What the world does not see is that we're going to do it again. We're going to blame the Jews for being the problem. The world is.
Well, you know, when we go back to what happened recently, back in October of 23, my vantage point on that is, look, number one, a nation has the right to defend itself. Number one. I don't care what nation it is. It may be a nation you don't like. I don't care. In principle, they have the right to defend themselves. Number two, until I am told with enough evidence that can be put before me, and I almost hate using this term because now it's become kind of cliche. It's been used so much, but that the attacks that happened back in October of 2023 in Israel, that they weren't self-inflicted or what people would say is a false flag, then I have to stand by a country defending itself, period. And unless it's been proven to me that that was some kind of way of being able to manipulate, then I'm not going to change my view.
Right.
Because individuals have the right to defend themselves, as do countries. I'm getting off onto a tangent here a little bit. That's why they don't want a lot of countries to have nuclear weapons. We're told that nuclear weapons are actually offensive. No, they're not. They're defensive weapons because they prevent other countries that may have the schemes and ideas of invading them from not doing so, because they know what can happen. It's kind of like a country gets a black belt. That smaller country can do some very bad, big damage to a country that may want to take advantage of it, like invading it.
Yeah.
And so that country now has a black belt and can defend itself. As soon as you get that country that has an atomic bomb, all bets are off, because now the playing field changes. The goalposts have changed.
Yeah, right.
That's all I'll say. I'll kind of speak in code here.
Well, peace through superior firepower is really
exactly
what
there is some truth to that.
But back to my point, what I'm encouraging the listeners to do here, and I'm encouraging them to do it on a wide variety of scales. We happen to be focusing on the international scale for a moment, because what you have going on in Israel is the mimetic sequence.
Yes.
Okay. On an international scale, fighting over the land. And what a lot of people don't see is that Israel is doing everything they can to interrupt the mimetic sequence, but not the other side. Every time they turn around and every time Israel says, oh, by the way, we're in, and because you're not wrong, But every time Israel turns around and says, we are entitled to defend ourselves, right? Then the other side goes, oh, but we're offended. We're and all that is it's the mimetic cycle ramping up, right? I mean, I've run into people, God bless them.
Yeah.
You know, I've just run into people who say, well, I'm just not going to do anything to, you know, I was planning a vacation to Israel and I'm not going there now because I'm just not going to do anything that would support Israel. And it's like, do you understand what you're saying? Do you have any clue what you just said? But my point being is that I'm encouraging people to take all these different illustrations that we used to make this larger point and look at what's going on in your life individually, you and your relationships with other people, within your family, within your community, at the state, at the national level, at the international level, is that this mimetic sequence is going to happen unless you interrupt it. It's going to happen unless you interrupt it. And the only real way to interrupt it is to adopt the Judeo-Christian worldview. That's the only way. You cannot, and see, most of the people who do this, they're flying blind. The reason it doesn't get interrupted is because they're totally unaware that they're even doing it. Because the whole scapegoat mechanism, right, to actually kill the scapegoat relies upon, you know, what's the phrase I'm searching for here, Kevin? You know, mass hysteria to get the masses to become convinced. Well, this is what we got to do. We got to kill so and so.
We got to go and kill whatever, and
whatever. You know,
and it goes into all the things that we've been discussing over this time that we've been together, where you have to dehumanize, lower, make the victim less than human. And we see all that go on. We saw Hitler do it with the Jews. Easy example. And we go, and this is the one thing everybody goes, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Right. But this is what you see it in novels, you see it in the movies, you see it in real life, and it's happened over and over and over again throughout history and right now.
Right. Let me flip that over for a second too, because we're seeing it right now in another way that I'm going to illustrate for people, which is labeling anything you disagree with Hitler. See, because I saw an advertisement the other day where someone said, yeah, you don't put Hitler in jail, you kill Hitler. See, so what you do, the dehumanizing, see, Hitler isn't human, according to that.
Right.
See, so he doesn't deserve a fair trial. You just execute him. Right.
And if he doesn't deserve a fair trial, then that can start to be extended out to other undesirables.
Exactly. See, so if you believe certain things that I disagree with, then I'm just going to label you as Hitler and therefore rationalize whatever it is I'm going to do.
Or you say, well, what, you supported the policies of Hitler? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that we have to extend the rights of even those we find the most vile, so that those of us who are not are afforded the same opportunity.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. But once again, what I'm trying to help people do here is to identify, because see, this is a subconscious thing.
Yes. So we don't even know we're doing it. It just is
so I'm really trying to help people identify it when they see it, right? That don't fall for this ruse of dehumanizing someone else by labeling them something that makes them, quote unquote, less than human, because then what that does is that allows you to rationalize, and therefore, here you go, systemize and codify the violation of the second half of the 10 Commandments in reverse.
Right.
Because that's exactly what it's doing, is it begins with me desiring what is not mine, and then there you go. I bear false witness against my neighbor. I label them Hitler. Then I can take what belongs to them, I can break covenant with them, and then I can even kill them.
It can all be rationalized.
It can all be rationalized. And it all begins with desiring what is not mine and then bearing false witness against my neighbor. Not speaking the truth about my neighbor.
Yeah, and so the thing with me is I look at this and I say, well, some of the enemy of what you're talking about is being able to think for yourself.
True. Yeah.
And not just running with, because one thing I learned, I founded a political party. I ran political campaigns, and I know how that stuff works. And you see, the best political slogans, because of the way the human mind works, and these people that are, way up in the political structure, they understand what I'm about to tell you. The human mind works in a certain way. The best political statements that they'll use are those that are incomplete sentences.
Absolutely.
It got so bad that Obama, he had in his second term, when he ran for his second term, his whole political campaign slogan was one word: forward. Well, forward to what? Just forward. And then what happens, and you see this in advertising as well. The human mind then goes, if I tell you not to do something, Tim, that's not the best way to go about teaching somebody, because the human mind actually says, well, you don't want me to do what?
Right.
What is it you don't want me to do? And then by, let me give you a good example. They put out a slogan like, don't smoke. Say, stop smoking. We want me to, the human mind just hears the word stop or don't. It doesn't necessarily hear the second word. So you're like, well, what don't you want me to do? And then you hear the smoking, you go, oh, well, and then the rates of smoking actually go up, not down, because of the way the human mind works. And so political slogans and things, you'll find the best ones that work are incomplete sentences, because then the human mind fills in what it wants to fill in to complete the thought.
Right. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So please continue.
Well, I mean, from where I'm sitting, that's really what I had to share with our audience today, is to put these illustrations out there, to show how these illustrations interconnect, to demonstrate the fact that every one of them is actually addressed in the Bible in some way, shape, or form. And that if we can learn to recognize these systems in ourselves and around us, then we can hopefully disrupt them, because this mimetic desire, conflict, violence sequence, it's in us. It's the whole mirror neuron and human behavior and stuff like that. We are going to do it. We are going to do it. The only way to interrupt it is to superimpose a system of morality. See, and that's all why the Bible is the Bible. That's why the Bible is what it is, and why I said the only way to disrupt this is the Judeo-Christian worldview, because at the bare minimum, it requires the 10 Commandments. See, and here's a reason why, yes, you should have the 10 Commandments in courthouses and schools and stuff like that, is that at the bare minimum, the 10 Commandments will stop the mimetic cycle.
Yeah.
If you follow it.
And the codification of our laws is admittedly all based on it. Even when you write something to the courts, you're using words like I pray to the court.
Yeah, absolutely. So once again, my encouragement to the listeners is that this is why the Judeo-Christian world order matters, is because human nature will devolve into violence. It's gonna happen.
It can't help but do so, because we're dealing with a fallen nature.
Exactly. And it's going to happen on the individual level. It's going to happen on the community level. It's going to happen on the national level. It's going to happen on the international level. It's going to happen. And it's the bare minimum. It's the 10 Commandments. And then at a maximum, it's like, well, be like Jesus, right? Yeah. Is what is going to interrupt this. It's like, okay, well, guess what? You desire that thing. I desire that thing. Guess what? Be blessed. Go ahead. Keep it. I don't want it. Right? Yeah. Why? And especially if it happens to be something that is not unique, meaning there's only one of them, right? It's one thing when you've got two people or two nations fighting over a thing where there literally is only one, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's something else entirely different where you've got people or nations fighting over something where, by the way, there's plenty of it. You just got to go over there and get your own. You just can't have his, right? When it comes to, money or food or resources or stuff like that, it's like, go get your own. You don't have to have his, right?
Well, but you know what's funny too is we see this in Christianity. Well, I wish I had that person's ministry. I wish I was, whatever. And it's like, no, stay in your lane because you're called to do what God has called you to do. Yeah. Find out what that is and then go do it. Because you may not be with the right personality type, your strengths and weaknesses may not conform to do what that person has to do. And you don't know what they put up with. And we run into a trap where people look at other people and they make judgments based on what they just see with their eyes on the outside. They're comparing what is going on with them on the inside to what they see on their outside. And that can never be an accurate depiction of reality.
Yeah, no, of course. And you're absolutely correct about, if you read scripture, if you read the Bible is really, really clear that God has created everybody as a unique individual. Okay. And it's our, not to take a tangent and go off on a totally different subject here, but if we have been created as unique individuals, our fallen nature veils that and clouds that, and our fallen nature doesn't help us discover who God has created us to be.
Yeah.
And that's another reason why the Judeo-Christian world order will interrupt the Mimetic Sequence, is because when you read the Bible says, oh yeah, by the way, you're a unique individual. You should be working on discovering who God has created you to be, not who the world tells you are. See, because our fallen nature and the systems of the world, they're gonna dictate to you, no, this is who you are. You need to identify like this, as opposed to seeking God and saying, okay, who did you create me to be? And therefore I'm going to go be that.
Now, I want to get to a point here where I think we're getting to the point where we're going to run into the danger of repeating ourselves. So
Correct.
What I want to do is give us a final summation, wrap all this up for us, and then we'll start the process of closing this.
Well, sure. Yeah, I mean, I've basically said what I need to say, so I'm just going to give a quick review and a reminder to the listeners of what's the point. What is the summary of what I said? The summary of what I said is that I am hoping, like I said, I use the illustration throughout this entire time of basically cooking a meal, right? That we put this pot over here, and we put this pot over here, and we put this pot over here, and each one of these dishes has its own flavor and it tastes wonderful. But the real thing we want to do is we want to put some of everything on our plate, and then now we get to enjoy this meal. So we talked about, what's your most valuable possession, your life, your liberty, your time. And we used that illustration to help people understand that private property is sacred. Okay.
Yeah.
And then we went on to discuss the fact that there's this really interesting sequence in scripture if you flip it over, because we all know the 10 commandments, but how many of us have ever looked at the 10 commandments in reverse? I mean, it blew me away, Kevin, when I realized, oh yeah, flip them over. Do it in reverse. So that is very unique. And it's very unique when you realize that that's a system, that following the 10 commandments in reverse is actually a system. It's a system of error, right? Then we talked about the generic makeup of any world religion, the 5 components of any world religion: sacred space, holy man, sacred code, holiday, and blood sacrifice, right?
Right.
And pointed out the fact that every world religion basically has that. But then I went on to point out, okay, there's this thing called, and hold that steady for a second. But then we talked about the concept of mimetics, that we have a neuron in our brain that makes us imitate the people that are right there in front of us, right? And unfortunately, we imitate desire, and then conflict, and then violence, right? So that's the mimetic sequence. But the way, and then that's on an individual scale. But then I describe mimetic conflict in a corporate setting, which is you could have an entire village ready to blow up because you've got this conflict here with this conflict here, this one here. Everybody is cross-pollinated.
Yeah.
with all these different mimetic sequences going on. The village is ready to explode. Well, the way you solve the problem of the village exploding is with a scapegoat. And then it turns out that the scapegoat sequence is actually identical to the religious sequence, that the components of religion and the components of the scapegoat atonement figure in scripture can be laid right over each other.
Yeah.
And they're superimposed, and that it's by understanding the work of Rene Girard that he pointed out that, the Bible is different. It's the same outline, but the details matter, and the Bible is different. That you don't blame the scapegoat. We're the problem, right? And at the very least, we have to confess our sins and send the goat into the wilderness. But even better, you need to embrace Jesus of Nazareth, who became sin for us, so that I can behave differently. And that if I can behave differently, then I can educate others to get them to behave differently. So hopefully that it transforms not only me, but transforms my community and my nation, and hopefully the world.
Exactly.
Because the human race will self-destruct if we don't do this.
Yeah, it's been really great 2.5 hours that we have spent going over this, and flew right by. Stay with me, Tim, after we go out of this, and just want to talk to you for a minute. But folks, I'm Kevin Gallaher, and before we go, Tim, just tell people a little bit about your website, God Save the King, and your radio show of the same name.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I really appreciate being on today. A great time to go over this really important information because, and what I do, right? You discover who, like we talked about, who are you? Who did God create you to be? And go do that, right? I'm not really a political commentator. I'm a Bible teacher, right? So even though my political views probably show through a little bit in the discussion today, it's really rooted and grounded in my understanding of Scripture. And that's what I hoped to help people see today, is these different scriptural pieces of the puzzle that if you see them and apply them, they can change what's going on in your life. But my name is Tim Keyes. My website is God Save the King, www.godsavetheking.org, where I focus on retelling the nativity story as it really would have happened. But I also branch out into many other areas of the Bible. I'm currently doing a teaching series on the book of Genesis, investigating the question is Genesis myth? So I'm re-exploring that word mythology. Now that's a very loaded thing, so go watch the videos if you want to understand why that is a thing. But I'm currently doing a series on that. And then I also have a radio show. My radio show is called God Save the King, and it's on the Truth Be Told radio network, and it airs, its regular broadcast time is Friday nights at 10 p.m. Eastern time. So anywhere you can hear the Truth Be Told radio network, you can hear my show.
That's excellent. And Tim, thank you. Before we go, people, I want to just stress to you that we broadcast out a number of different ways. We broadcast right from our stream, of course. You can go right to the website, truthbetoldnetwork.org, hit the listen button, and you're listening to the broadcast. We have an Android app. You can download the Android app and be listening that way. We also broadcast, I'm very proud to say, to every smart device in the world. So if you have a smart speaker, Alexa, Google, Apple HomePod, if you have an iPhone, if you have an Android phone, we broadcast to all of those. Just use the keyword and you'll be able to listen to the Truth Be Told radio network in that way. It's really easy to do. We are also in probably 15 or 20 different aggregates. These are places like TuneIn Radio where they have a collection of radio stations that you can select from, click on, and listen to. We're in a bunch of those. If you want to get information about how you can listen, email me at tbtrn7@gmail.com. The TBTRN7 stands for Truth Be Told Radio Network. TBTBR7, the number, at gmail.com. And you can listen that way. We also started, we just went over a year, Tim, with our music network. And that is called Whitestone Streaming Network. We went on the air last year on June 1st of 2023. And so it's now a little over a year old. And we present to you anointed Christian music, a little bit of a twist. So if you're watching this and you're a Christian musician, or you know somebody who is, that's really talented at your church, they can play guitar, piano, drums, whatever, and they write their own Christian music. The problem is they really don't have a place to get that out to. Now, you can go to places like SoundCloud and a few others, and I'm not disparaging those places. The problem is that you're going to get lost in an ocean of a lot of other types of music. It's not there exclusively for someone like you. Contact us at whitestonesradio@gmail.com, and we can send you the release forms and everything so that you can have your music played worldwide on the radio. And we heavily go out to smart speakers and over the air, over the internet, and over to our Android app for Whitestone Streaming Network. So, folks, thank you for joining us here. I really do thank you for taking the time. I think it's an important subject because right now we're looking at exactly what Tim and I have talked about with pieces, parcels of land, people, and trials, things going on in the world, just to put it that way, that you can go and identify these things that we've talked about, regardless of what side of the political spectrum you may be on. The principle is still there. You can still see what is happening. So join us again next time. Tune in to Tim's show and the other shows that you hear on the network. You know how to do that, folks. I'm Kevin Gallaher. I thank you for watching and listening today. Please tune in again next time. Until then, God bless you and goodbye.